Welcome. My name is William Messakar. I am a master model railroader in the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. I want to welcome all of you to the virtual layout tour we'll have presented today by members of the NMRA. We would encourage you to find out about the NMRA and join in order to participate in these virtual tours. We have other virtual clinics and other activities for the National Model Railroad Association that we think you'll find a big help to your modeling, and you'll get to meet model railroaders just like you. So welcome to our tour, and I hope you enjoy it.
Good morning, everybody. Sitting here in my workshop with the unbuilt kit repository behind me. I'm Bill Sornsin, and I'm going to walk through a little overview of the layout. It's a shortened version of a long form presentation I give, which goes into the historical background of the Cascade Division and the particular scenes I chose to model and how I developed the layout concept. But today we have a little bit less time, so I'm going to do a brief overview and then do a live layout tour. So with that, let me switch to the presentation. So the area that's modeled is what was in 1955 the first subdivision of the Cascade Division between Seattle and Wenatchee, the first sub. And as many of you know, that in 1955 included an electric district between Skykomish and Wenatchee. And the intent is to model this district as it was in 1955. And really the major focus is to model the operations. So the operational priorities for me included in rank order, and this is part of the development of the layout, prototypical dispatching using timetable and train orders, the real paperwork. Major yard switching, Interbay was kind of the center of the universe for that. I'm really modeling Appleyard in Wenatchee more as a staging yard. The electrified district, as mentioned, with helpers, local industrial switching, of which there was substantially more in 1955 than there is now. All those little towns going up the west slope of the Cascades had industries. Monroe was absolutely hopping then, and right now it pretty much just has wolf kill feed, but very different back then. It's set up for prototypical signaling. I haven't really got started on that, but I've laid in the electrical groundwork for that. The signature passenger trains like the Empire Builder and the North Coast Limited leaving King Street, and interchange with Milwaukee Road, Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, and then block setouts and pickups as appropriate. Everett is really notable for that. And then lastly, coach yard and passenger train switching at King Street. So I'll just give a little taste of some of the scenes that are probably less familiar, even to people who live around here. One of them is that Interbay had an icing facility. It wasn't very big. We all think of Wenatchee and the huge platform at Appleyard, but Western Fruit Express, partially owned by Great Northern, had lots of smaller facilities, and one of them was just north of Interbay Yard. This view is taken from the 23rd Street overpass, which is now Emerson Place overpass, looking railroad east or physically north at the icing platform. You can see a little ice house with a spiral ramp to get ice blocks down to the platform. And then another thing, which there's several folks on the call that have run here, and they know that the Oiler is a very popular train. That was a train that ran out of Interbay every single day. It was a 16-hour job, 6 days a week. And I've interviewed, most have passed away, but guys that ran this job in the middle 50s. And it was very common to come out of Interbay with as many as 80 cars and bang them around at Point Wells, at Edmonds, at Milepost. Great Northern had a fuel facility there. I think the Air Force tanks in Mukilteo hadn't come online yet. But the point is, this is a key part of operating the railroad and was a signature train that ran every single day. In fact, they ran out and back to Everett twice each day, going to Beans in Seattle in between. So that's the Oiler. And then I mentioned Monroe. Here's a picture from late 40s, early 50s. Dave Sproul, who many of you know, grew up there and seems to have a photographic memory. He's been absolutely gold for me in researching how things worked in Monroe back in that era. If you zoom in a little bit, well, first of all, you can see Wolfkill Feed and Seed on the right. Most of those buildings have been upgraded, but it still stands there today. And Don, I watched BNSF switch a car out of there a few days ago. If we zoom in, you can see that the Monroe track layout back in 1955 had a lot more going on than it does today. There's a long 48-car industry track parallel with the main line that hosted 4 or 5 industries. There's a gravel spur, which some of you remember prior to the early 90s was still there. And anyway, that's just one town. And there was a lot going on in 1955. So important to me that we use prototypical paperwork. Right now in the layout, we don't yet have phones working. That's in progress, but we do operate using the timetable and then verbal train orders to modify those or run extras. So you're seeing here a 1951 Cascade Division timetable. And if I zoom in, you can see the various trains that were scheduled back then between Seattle and Wenatchee on the first sub. And then here we have an example of a paper train order addressed to C&E Engine 569 at St. Cloud. But the idea here is really to dispatch it prototypically, have operators copy orders and hand them to the train crews to get their train around the layout. It's more fun than it sounds. Some guys look at this at first and say, well, this sounds like work, but it's actually a really fun way to run the railroad, because once you have a clearance and some orders, you're making your own decisions and you can kind of make your own way around the layout, which is how it was in the 50s. And once you get the hang of it, it's quite fun. Even Burr agrees sometimes. And then here's an example of a train sheet. This is an NP train sheet. This was the dispatcher's basically daily Bible. They would come in and spread this thing out across their table. And down the middle is essentially the timetable. Sorry, not the timetable, but the list of stations in orders, station order, the capacity of the sidings and side tracks. And then in the columns to the left and right of that, moving from the center out, the dispatcher would write down the train number and the crew and then record as the train moved along. And you can't read the writing, but you can see the station times in there are recorded by hand as each operator called into the dispatcher, initially by telegraph, later by phone. And that's the origination of the OS term. So they would say, OS Monroe, number 1 is by at 3:33 p.m. And the dispatcher would record that. So just a little bit about the layout itself, some givens here, a lot of room to work with. It's a 3,000 square foot purpose-built building with radiant heat and a high ceiling. The main line as designed will be over 1,000 feet ultimately, most of it single track. Siding length is set at 18-foot minimum, which will hold about 30 cars plus locomotives and caboose. 42-inch minimum radius, 48-inch on outside curves, where you're viewing the curve from the outside because it's more notable. The gaps between passenger cars or long steam locomotives are more noticeable on outside curves. Ruling grade comparable to the prototype. I've mostly gotten away with 36-inch or more aisle width. When you have an operating model railroad, the human traffic becomes an important thing to think about. There are some pinch points though. And then we've talked about the dispatcher. I'm an NCE fan. And even though the Cascade Division ran its last steam in 1952, we cheat a little bit and run some steam here as well as diesel and electric. So here's a shot many of you haven't seen of the layout room under construction. This is in 2002. Obviously can't build a railroad like that. I'd get rained on. So this was the initial excavation, and you can see the concrete. For those of you who've been here, or you'll see it in a moment, on the right side in shadow there, that's where Interbay Yard and King Street is. So that segment going off into the distance to the right is actually under the lawn. And it turns out this building is really cheap to heat because it's mostly underground. So expensive to build, but cheap to heat. So that's good. And then here's a shot. One of the things you can see here is those stud walls in the distance. I was a little shy with the contractors as we were building these things about my true intentions. But, guys being guys, all men actually like trains, and they eventually got wise to what I was up to. And I showed them my CAD plans for the layout. I'm a meticulous guy, an engineer by training. So I literally had everything out in CAD. And they said, well, what are you going to do for these dividers between, scenes? We could build those stud walls with these CAD plans in a couple of days. And I thought, holy cow. So that's what they did. So part of the layout was actually built by the original general contractor, those initial dividers and partial walls and full walls. The only thing I'll say is you better be really confident in your track plan to make that commitment that early, but it's worked out fine. And here's a view from the outside. Looks a little bit like a depot or arguably a German bunker in Normandy, but it's a pretty durable building, concrete and steel. And when you first come in, you enter into the crew lounge area, which I'll show you on the live tour. So let me switch to that now. So I'm in the workshop now, messy workshop. If it's not messy, you're not doing real work, right? So yeah. So let's move out. And I'll start with the crew lounge area. So when you first walk in, here's the entrance. I'll actually walk over here. You get into this area where, this layout ultimately is intended to support as many as 18 to 20 operators. So I need a comfortable place for people to sit around and BS while they're waiting for their next train. So it's a little bit of a crew lounge slash railroad museum. There's a couple seats here from the Empire build that I had restored and reupholstered. Some interesting items around the walls and on display. Here's a horn off of a GP7. There's a an award plaque to a Chinese steam engine crew that I bought when I was there in 2004. There's one of these, you can't see it very well, one of these trophies that James Hill was fond of giving out to various farmers and cattle ranchers around the railroad, rewarding them for productivity. Because as many of you historians know, one of Hill's great focuses was developing the industry and the essentially the traffic base for his railroad as he went. So he put as much effort into that as he did actually building the railroad. So it's a nice area. I play drums too, so there's an area for the drum set and the display case with all the steam engines I probably won't put decoders into. But you come into the room and you get this hopefully nice first impression, even though there's not much scenery. But I've got the layout, at least parts of it, with a valance and a fascia. And the area you're looking at now with all this pink foam is actually Ballard. So one of the first things you see is this essentially placeholder bridge with a little stairway underneath it. And that's the where the Ballard drawbridge will go. But I want to actually start the tour at King Street because it's easy to be oriented when I start there. So let's speedily move along because this is pretty cool. And so here we are at King Street Station, the center of gravity, certainly to the east, up to Everett and over to Wenatchee. And then to the south, I modeled part of the Northern Pacific double track going through the Soto district of Seattle and then down to staging. And the purpose of that is so we can model the passenger trains, Northern Pacific and even some Great Northern, leaving King Street for Portland, like the North Coast Limited, as well as modeling the coach yard. And those of you who haven't been here in a while, the coach yard is now complete. I didn't have room to model every track, but we've got 5 tracks and lots of currently Northern Pacific cars in there, some beautiful W&R cars. And if you are a train that leaves on the Northern Pacific double track, you will go through this hole in the wall, and we do have some Soto Industries. You'll follow the train with this very convenient set of LED lights and find yourself down in staging. And this staging, as you can see, represents Portland, Yakima, Hoquiam, and Argo. We run transfer runs to Argo. We run the North Coast Limited to Auburn, and all of that goes to this massive 36-foot staging yard. So King Street Station Switcher, a cooperation between me and a guy named Springer in Baltimore who runs CMR, Custom Model Railroads. And he's known for, he does kits and also custom work. And what he is known for is laser etched acrylic. And I looked at a lot of ways to model King Street and finally concluded there's so much detail involved that it would be a nightmare to. So we came up with a scheme where we developed CAD drawings of it with help from Washington State and turned that into drawings that his machine could use. And essentially all 4 walls of King Street are etched out of a single block of acrylic. And then the painting became the hard part because we had to use a 000 brush to do the little bond bricks. But it ended up with, it's actually full scale King Street with the tower and everything. It lights up. I'm working on getting that wired, which is why this is a little bit messy. But you know, just a beautiful job. And so it's a real signature thing. You'll notice it's got the crappie awning that got replaced a few years ago. This came in the 1940s. My goal was to model this as it was in 1955. And there you have King Street. And with that, we'll continue the tour by running a train because why not? So let me turn this on and we'll run the Cascadian. And, you know, while I'm waiting to acquire, I should point out this is a beautiful model that was built by the late Dwayne. So let's get the headlight going here. And the Mars and run this thing. And we'll go through the Bill Decker honorary puzzle switch here. There was both a single slip and a double slip switch in this era at King Street. Yes, they are a bear to get working well. So when you leave King Street, through a tunnel underneath Jackson Street. And where this train will come out is in this area, Interbay, residing between Magnolia and Queen Anne for the lights. It had a number of railroad served piers. Those piers will go here where all this junk is right now. You can see the lowered area for the water. And it was served both by the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern. So the Northern Pacific had an Interbay yard. Little known fact, that was pretty busy in the 1950s. It only had a few tracks, but it was part of their branch line between Seattle and Bend and Snoqualmie. So it was an important yard for staging industrial switching for the Terry Avenue line, as well as things organized for train to Woodinville and North Bend and so forth. So we actually have a job that runs about 3 or 4 hours on the layout, which is the working this yard and the Soto in Seattle. All right, so here comes the train. And that brings us to Interbay proper. So this has been kind of my big pandemic project, which is to the infrastructure done. It includes crossing of 4 Great Northern tracks by a Northern Pacific spur and a lot of hand-built switches. I actually use microengineering number 6s, but for number 8s or crossovers or anything like that, I pretty much handcraft my switches using either wood ties, or whenever I can, I try to use the Central Valley tie strips. I'll actually show you this a little bit in the King Street area. You can see how it looks where it's painted. Obviously, the advantage is can do things like have switches or have geometries that would have on the hand building. Obviously, you still have to form your points and frogs and so forth, but it leads to a very reliable switch. And if there's one thing about model railroad operations, your track has got to be reliable or people get frustrated in a hurry. It really only takes, 1 or 2 bad switches to, potentially ruin a session for people. So I'm going to slow down the Cascadian and take you underneath here. Look at Interbay a little bit more. It is designed to be operated from this pit outside of the main aisle. And this comes from doing a lot of operating sessions over the years and observing that yards get really congested with a lot of wide bodies. And if you can find a way to have the yard operators their thing out of the main aisle, that works really well. So I'll leave Interbay here in the interest of time, but the yard is modeled essentially with every track but one, I believe, as it existed in 1955. I didn't have room for the 3rd rip track, but it's all done. And when we get back to operations, this railroad was supporting about 8 operators, and we'll be up to 10 or 11 thanks to this yard being complete. And just for completeness, since I showed you of that icing platform at Interbay, that is that track. No platform yet. The reefer cars. All right, let's continue. So you exit Interbay, you go through this little knot under and go over what will be the Ballard Bridge. And now we're in the Ballard area where we've started to build some, early landforms. Lots of help from Lee Marsh and Don Treadle and others. We'll get some scenery going here. And this is now, as you know, or maybe not, was entirely double track in this era between Interbay and Ballard. There's a few single track sections today in Edmonds and Mukilteo, but back then it was entirely 2 main tracks, directional running all the way to Everett. So as this train progresses, I'll speed it up here. We sweep around this big curve, which is characteristic of the line following Puget Sound. This is actually the Golden Gardens curve. And then thanks to Mike O'Connell at Chooch, we can have a beach and a seawall, just as on the real thing. Our next stop is Point Wells, where in this era there's a whole bunch of switching of tank cars. We won't model the tanks, but the oiler has a lot of work to do with a couple of tracks here. As we move towards Edmonds, you get the Unical facility here with both asphalt and oil loading. And here we can see the Empire Building waiting for us in Edmonds. And this is an anomaly, but I do want to show you this beautiful model of Skykomish, which is out of place right now, but we'll go up to Sky once we get that part of the layout built. So as we pass through Edmonds, we roll along some, additional embankments along Puget Sound and eventually get to Everett Junction. And that's a key place. First goes on to follows the coast of Puget Sound to Vancouver. And then we'll go, so I'll just stay here. I'm probably too far from the Wi-Fi. We are underground after all. So this is Everett. On the right side, we pass line. And at the end of the hallway, which I wanted to show you, but it's going to cut me off, what I call the blender. It's a helix complex. It's the turnback curve for the main line. Vancouver trains go down the helix and into this staging area, which Burr and Dunn and others are so familiar with. And this represents a staging yard that we're as far as about here, which is Lowell. Lowell is the junction, backside of Everett. The south about it is that the Northern Pacific and Milwaukee Road had traffic rights over the Great Northern, and Lowell is where they left the Great Northern Main Line. And we are modeling that. You'll be able to, run a Northern Pacific train, comes off at Lowell, goes down to for the Milwaukee Road. So at this point, we move to the under construction bit. So I'll just give you a brief benchwork overview and how great it will be one day. But the pandemic has actually helped accelerate things. Here we're following the main line, and you can see as we move along that the railroad follows the outer wall, this long straight tangent where I'm actually using, believe it or not, drywall as the subroad bed because it's super straight and it doesn't shrink. Can't really use it anywhere else, but it's great for town sites and for long straight stretches. And then I use, Snohomish roadbed on top of that. But this long tangent is the tangent between Snohomish and Monroe. And any of you who have train watched in that area know how fun it is to sit in Monroe and look at a headlight 5 miles away. And here is where we get into Monroe. I showed you a little layout of how that looked back in the day. And so this area here is where all the industries and so forth will be located from Monroe. And then from Monroe, you can continue along, you cross Woods Creek, which is why this section of benchwork is lowered. The main line continues along. I'll explain what's above you in a moment. You curl around here this rapidly. I think I'm okay on time so far, Burr, right?
Yeah.
And that brings you to Gold Bar. And Gold Bar was and is essentially a storage yard. From Gold Bar, then you curl around the end of this room and go into this room in the middle, which I haven't shown you yet. And this is essentially the line climbing up through Index, through Grot, ultimately to Skycomish. And here's an example of mushroom construction. So right now you're looking at the main line out of Monroe. If I step up here, you can see this level above will be Skycomish, but it's viewed from the other side. So this area here, which is essentially a saw room, will have a 14-inch raised floor, and this upper scene here will be viewed from this side, whereas everything here is viewed from this side, and everything where my hand is essentially the back side of Skycomish, and we'll have a backdrop. So we're using the same vertical area twice, levels of the layout, but depending on which room you're in, you only see one scene at a time. And that's the mushroom concept, and it's pretty cool. And it's easier to build than it is to describe, I will say that. Now, one cool part of the mushroom is that that second level is high enough that you can walk under it. And so I concocted this little bridge here. This is the tail track of the Skycomish Y, and it spans the aisle, and at 6'1", I can walk under it without hitting my head. No promises for Burr Stewart, but it works for me. Now with that, I'm going to switch back to the little presentation and question times. So here you can see, I've switched back to the presentation. Here you can see an overhead track plan of what we saw with King Street and Interbay. I found it's actually easier to show the track plan after I run a train. But anyway, it turns out because King Street is actually built on a diagonal, the main line runs diagonally through there. And Interbay Yard is an S-curve that the real breakthrough in my track planning came when I figured out that I could nestle these side by side with a diagonal aisle. I will say, don't try this without CAD, but since I was comfortable with that, that's what I did. And if you're interested, the way I laid this all out is I used a large scale plotter that I bought secondhand to essentially print out the track's full size. I used the ceiling grid as a reference point, used a little laser plumb to lay everything out first on the floor, and then I built the benchwork, and then laid the tracks with great precision for Interbay. Now that I'm out of Seattle and it's mainly single track and little towns, I don't have to go through this elaborate process, but it worked really well for this complex track work. So here's the final plan on the main level, and we went through most of this. We left King Street. We followed through where the Ballard Bridge is. We went around this big curve of Golden Gardens. Here's Point Wells. We went through Edmonds right here. And we more or less finished up in Everett, where I lost connection. The main line again, goes around a curve here and goes through the Everett, PA area. And here's Lowell, where I was talking about the NP. Then we continued the benchwork tour. I went through here and all the way down to Monroe, curled around here. The part you didn't see is how the track curls around into that other room, makes a huge horseshoe curve at Index, and then goes to the upper level. And here's how that plays out. So, with my little benchwork tour, I showed you where Skycomish will be with the Y and the tail track on the upper level. From Sky then, and here, the track plan is the only way to show you, it actually continues climbing and winds around and eventually gets up to a level of 90 inches above the floor. The plan then is to essentially suspend from the ceiling, go to the back wall, and down, down, down. And I'll show you how that works. In 3D, this is one of the advantages of using Third Planet. With no extra work, all I had to do was set elevations, and then you just click a button, and this is rendered automatically. No technical skill required, but on the right side, you can see Skycomish. That little gray box is supposed to be the substation. And then in the distance, you leave Sky, and then you come back on this middle wall. You can see the track is higher. And then on the far left, that's essentially where Cascade Tunnel will be. From there then, Cascade Tunnel, you come down, 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 and reappear here. Actually, I think I can zoom this. Yes, I can. Cascade Tunnel East Portal. You do a lap of the room at about 68 inches. And if you go through Winton, I'm modeling Winton and Kashmere, just two towns, mainly for aisle congestion. And with Timetable and Train Order, it's really nice to have good long distances between towns, so that you can't just look down the aisle and see that Jerry is standing there. It puts a little fear in you when you're leaving that siding if you can't actually see what's coming. But you will end up in Wenatchee, and that's the crew change point. Zoom in there. Wenatchee's at the upper part here. And at Wenatchee, you'll get off your train. And from Wenatchee, there's a ramp down that goes into the workshop where I'm sitting now. And that's where the east end staging will be. And that is the Cascade Division. I'll close with a little progress report. There's over 2,000 feet of track and service, over 150 turnouts, of which 50 or 60 are hand laid. Almost 700 linear feet of bench work is in, with some more to go. Fully inspected car fleet of about 300 cars and growing. And we were having monthly work sessions, but hope to start those up this summer. And we've been operating regularly since the summer of 2015. A closing comment about big layouts. They may or not be impressive, but they aren't necessary to have fun in this hobby. And if you're considering one, think really hard about the time, skills, dollars, and maintenance required, especially maintenance. Turnout count and grades are the big factors that slow you down and make this hard. It certainly shouldn't be your first layout. You better have a crew to help and operators. And if you're going to build a big layout, take it slow, build it for maintainability and accessibility, or it'll just become a nightmare and you'll leave the hobby because it can very quickly become just too much. And relentlessly seek efficiencies. I forgot to show some of the things that Burr asked for, like my copper tape and so forth for feeders, but you really got to think about ways to speed construction. A big thing for me was using prefab warehouse or floor joists for the yard. I've got two 35-foot joists that support my entire yard. I think when I bought them, they were like, $32 a piece. What a bargain for the time it saved. Essentially, the girder part of the L girders, pre-made. And then think about mass production techniques like pre-wiring pigtails on your tortoises and so forth. And when you can, trade time for dollars. Like decoder installs, I outsource. I can't do everything myself. There wouldn't be enough time. And lastly, phase the construction so you can run early, which we've been doing, and I'm really glad for that. That's it.
Thanks very much. Who has any questions?
Hey, Bill, it's Robin. I'm just glad to see progress during the pandemic. That's great. And Interbay pretty much finished. That's lovely.
Thanks. I can't wait to run it.
Bill, I wanted to ask about the reefer platform over by where Time Oil is in Interbay. Is that right?
Well, the reefer is by Interbay. Yeah, close to Time Oil. That's right.
Yeah, in terms of operational fun, that means you have to run the reefers across the main line over to the other side to be iced. Is that right?
Yeah, fun is one word for it. No, I've talked to like Jim Matson and other guys who ran at Interbay.
Yeah.
A pain.
Yeah, that's great. That's what you want.
Well, the big thing was the engines on the inside of it. Yeah, for us, it's fine. You have to worry about the Empire Builder just to get your engine away. So yeah.
How did your interest in the Great Northern Railway come to pass?
I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, next to a Great Northern conductor, passenger conductor, Alan Carolyn. And when I was about 8 years old, he gave me a copy of Lines West. And I mean, I was already into it just from watching trains, 8 blocks from my house, but that pretty much sealed the deal. And I always wanted to model Stevens Pass. Growing up in Fargo, we didn't travel much. I don't think I left the state until I was a teenager. And then to finally, move to Seattle, it was kind of meant to be.
I think all us Northwesterners owe a great debt of gratitude to Charles Wood, his books, particularly the Great Northern books, but all of them are just fantastic.
Nice background, Lee. Getting fired up to build more trees.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Oh, it's much smaller layout, so and get to trees faster.
Bill, your layout obviously is going to be a huge layout.
Yes, and all that entails, good and bad. I love hosting visitors, so once that we're able to do that again, you guys have my email, and probably will organize something through through the region or the division, and can't wait to get humans in here again. Cross your fingers, get your shots.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was marvelous.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today and wish you great modeling.